Picture this. You're trudging through a dusty Anatolian village in 1683. You're overworked, underpaid, and everyone hates your guts. You finally knock on the door of a farmer who owes 7 acres, and instead of handing it over, he releases his goats on you. Welcome to the glamorous life of a tax collector in the Ottoman Empire. A job so miserable, even rats would have filed for early retirement. But here's the twist. The Ottoman bureaucracy wasn't just brutal, it was weirdly modern. And that's where things get interesting. Or at least, sleepy in the most entertaining way possible. If you're already considering quitting your job to collect medieval taxes, hit like. Subscribe for more bedtime banter and underrated historical pain. It's history, but soft, sarcastic, and soothing. Let's take a moment to appreciate the soothing, bureaucratic hum of a well-oiled tax machine. Not something you'd expect to find in a medieval empire stretching across 3 continents, dripping in turbans, tulips, and tyranny. But surprise. The Ottoman Empire was a bureaucracy nerd's dream. If your dreams happen to involve meticulously folded scrolls and the gentle sound of a calligraphy brush documenting your annual wheat output, at the heart of this not-so-thrilling, yet deeply compelling system were the defterders, the financial technocrats of their day. Think accountants, but more self-important. They were the empire's elite number crunchers, clerical overlords who turned taxation into a finely tuned ritual. Their weapon, the defter, a giant leather-bound ledger that looked like something you'd summon a demon from. But instead, it just catalogued your goat count and outstanding debts to the state. Now, to understand just how extra the Ottomans were about their paperwork, you need to forget the modern idea of receipts. This wasn't your crumpled gas station slip floating in your glove box. Ottoman receipts were elegant, handwritten affairs, detailed, formal, and blessed with more ink than the actual transactions they described. Every tax payment, every land transfer, every dispute over who technically owned that suspiciously fertile patch of barley field, it all made it into the in triplicate, sometimes quadruplicate. The Ottomans didn't just write things down, they curated your financial existence. Let that sink in. Somewhere in the imperial archives, there's a 16th century entry recording that one time your great-grand-uncle paid 3 silver coins late, with a note explaining it was because his ox had a limp. This empire didn't just track its citizens, it archived their excuses. So where did this glorious paperwork parade begin? It all started in the central bureaucracy, located in the beating, bureaucratic heart of Istanbul, the Sublime Port. Now, sublime might sound romantic, but this was less candlelit poetry reading and more Kafka meets a sandal factory. Inside, scribes sat at low desks under arches carved with florid inscriptions, scratching away with reed pens like caffeinated spiders. And those scribes, they were trained. You didn't just wander in one day and say, "Hey, I like numbers, sign me up." No, you had to study in the Ancient Yawn school, where you learned math, languages, finance, etiquette, and probably how not to scream while updating population records for the 200th time. Once you graduated, if you were lucky, you got to spend your days cataloguing tax obligations for villagers you'd never visit, under lighting dimmer than your social life. But oh, the power! A defter with a good memory and a sharp pen could control the fate of an entire province. Land grants, military stipends, religious exemptions, all passed through their ink-stained fingers. They were trusted not just to count money, but to decide who mattered. To mark a village as taxable was to recognize its official existence, and to erase one, that was to ghost an entire population from the records of history. And it got even more specific. The empire conducted massive tax surveys, known as narrated, sending teams of officials across the empire to record, well, everything. These guys would march into a town and start asking questions like, how many adult males over age 15? How many acres planted with millet? How much cheese did your goats produce in 1526? It was big data to 500 years early, minus the server room. Now here's the fun bit. They actually used this information. Unlike some modern systems where paperwork gets filed into the void of forgotten forms, the Ottomans were alarmingly efficient. If your town had more wheat than last year, guess what? Higher taxes next season. Yay, productivity. If your harvest was low, maybe they'd reduce your quota. Or maybe they'd just accuse you of hiding your figs and double it anyway. It was a toss-up, but for all its function, the system had flair. Ottoman scribes were poets of taxation. The margins of these ledgers were often adorned with flourishes, little rhyming couplets, or ominous warnings in exquisite calligraphy. He who deceives the defteder deceives God. Imagine getting that written on your tax notice instead of a smiley emoji sticker. Comforting dot, of course. Not everything ran smoothly. Occasionally, a scribe would forget to mark a payment, or worse, miswrite a village's population by, say, 300 people. And what happens when your boss is a sultan with a flair for public executions? Yeah, one miscount, and your career and head could be neatly filed away in the department of oops. So yes, forgetting to dot an I might not seem like a big deal unless you worked under Suleiman the Magnificent, who was very much not a fan of sloppy arithmetic. Legend has it, one defteder who fudged the army payroll found himself reassigned to a small, remote village in the Balkans. No horse, no ink, no sympathy, just a field and time to reflect. But the weirdest part? It kind of worked. The Ottoman bureaucracy was one of the longest surviving administrative systems in world history. While kings in Europe were still stabbing each other over shiny hats and debating whether women were allowed to read, the Ottomans were running fiscal audits with colored seals and carbon copies, okay. Ink copies, but you get the point. It was a system where form mattered as much as function, where power meant knowing what column to write the sheep tax in, and where every villager, from Damascus to the Danube, knew that someone, somewhere, in a domed office in Istanbul, had a copy of their family's potato, yield from 15.7 to dot. So the next time you're elbow deep in IRS forms or queuing for a municipal permit, just remember, it could be worse. You could be a 16th century Ottoman scribe, hunched over a ledger the size of your torso, trying to figure out if Fatma's chicken count qualifies for a tax exemption, while praying you don't spill ink on the Sultan's favorite margin poem. If you ever wanted a job that guarantees you'll be hated by peasants, resented by officials, and possibly assaulted by sheep, then congratulations, you might just have what it takes to be a multi-zeme. The Ottoman Empire's freelance tax collector, part-time landlord, and full-time public enemy number one. Let's start with the basics. The multi-zeme wasn't some bored civil servant sipping date syrup behind a desk. No, this was a guy who bought the right to collect taxes. Yes, you heard that correctly. It was called iltism, a system so brilliantly unstable that it makes crypto look like grandma's savings account. Wealthy men, and it was always men, would pay an upfront sum to the state for the privilege of squeezing villagers like overripe pomanics. In theory, the idea was simple. The empire gets a guaranteed income, and the multizeme keeps whatever extra he can extract. In practice, it turned rural taxation into an unregulated Hunger Games, but with fewer cameras and more pitchforks. Let's picture it. You re-multizeme in the mid-1600s. You've just spent a small fortune acquiring the tax rights to a sleepy little district outside Aleppo. Congratulations. You are now legally entitled to collect taxes on farmland, livestock, markets, bakeries, marriages, and sometimes things that don't even technically exist, like potential grain. A delightful euphemism for you were supposed to plant this year, so cough it up anyway. Your goal? Profit. Your toolset? A sullen entourage of scribes, guards, and debt collectors on horseback. Your vibe? Somewhere between an overconfident landlord and a traveling debt demon. Every day, you saddle up, ride out, and prepare to face what no one ever warned you about. The villagers hate your guts, and why wouldn't they? To them, you're not a civil servant. You're a glorified extortionist who appears once a month to demand coins they don't have, often while eating the last piece of flatbread from their table and commenting on how lazy the goats look this year. But don't worry, you're not alone in your unpopularity. Even other officials hated multizemes. To the bureaucracy, these guys were disruptive, corrupt, and borderline feral. Sultans tried to regulate them, restrict them, and occasionally remove them altogether. But the system kept coming back, zombie style, because, surprise, it worked. For a while, sort of now. Remember that everything multizemes collected wasn't just gold. Oh no, that would be too convenient. Taxes could come in the form of grain, livestock, olive oil, spices, textiles, or even manual labor. Imagine trying to meet your quarterly earnings target in the form of goats and jars of pickled turnips. Not exactly liquid assets. And because these tax farmers were operating like desperate contestants on a sad game show, they got creative. Overassessments were common. A village might be told it owed 10 gold coins when it actually owed 5. The multiseme would pocket the difference and justify it later with a shrug and some paperwork that mysteriously caught fire in a caravan accident. Of course, this creative accounting didn't go unnoticed. Occasionally, villagers would band together and file a complaint with the Qadi, the local judge. But unless you had actual documentation, which most peasants didn't because writing was expensive and papyrus doesn't grow on trees, your appeal went about as well as a screaming match with a brick wall. Spoiler, the wall won. Sometimes the villagers skipped the paperwork altogether and just fought back. There are documented cases of multizemes being run out of town, their horses stolen, their records burned, and in one especially poetic case, being tied to a cart and rolled downhill into a ravine full of very confused chickens. Folk justice was not subtle. But here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. Some multizemes weren't villains, at least not entirely. A few were local elites, even former peasants themselves, who knew the people and understood that squeezing them too hard would kill the goose before the taxes hatched. These rare unicorns of Ottoman finance might negotiate, forgive debts, or even distribute food in famine years. They were like the good landlords your friend swears exists, but you've never met. Unfortunately, kind-hearted multizemes had short careers and even shorter lifespans. Mercy didn't generate profits, and the empire didn't care how many babies died, as long as the silver made it back to Istanbul on time. So yes, if you showed too much compassion, You'd likely find your contract revoked and reassigned to a guy nicknamed the Mallet. Let that sink in. You could be fired for not being awful enough. The system was, in essence, a tax auction. Provinces were sliced up like lamb at a feast and sold to the highest bidder. The poor became profit margins, their survival balanced against someone's investment return. It was efficient, brutal, and incredibly profitable, right up until it wasn't. The deeper irony, many multi-seams were also in debt. To buy the tax rights, they had to borrow money, often from shady lenders or relatives who treated interest. Rates like a joke no one laughs at. So now you've got a guy deeply in debt, trying to collect taxes from people who don't have money, using methods that make banditry look like a noble profession. And still, they showed up, month after month, with ledgers, guards, and a face that said, "I know you hate me, and frankly, I deserve it." They endured insults, theft, disease, and occasionally the heartbreak of realizing someone fed their tax sheep to the janissaries during a military inspection. Why would anyone choose this? Why volunteer to be the human embodiment of an invoice? Maybe it was greed, maybe it was ambition, maybe it was just the twisted illusion of power, the ability to walk into someone's home, look them in the eye, and say, "That chicken, she owes me 6 eggs." And maybe, just maybe, they believed they were part of something grander, the machinery of empire, the divine wheel of order spinning forward one aki at a time. So the next time you complain about customer service, remember, at least you're not a multi-seam being paid in barley by a man who named his goats after insults. And if you ever feel unloved, unwanted, or unpopular, just be glad you're not knocking on a peasant's door in 1662, asking for their last bundle of firewood. With a smile, let's step out of the horse-drawn horror show that was the multi-seam's life, and into the real heart of the Ottoman Empire. The people who made it all run got absolutely nothing for it, and were still expected to smile when the taxman showed up. We're talking about the peasants. You know, the ones who actually grew the grain, raised the goats, and built the villages that made the empire possible. The ones whose reward for keeping civilization alive was to be taxed like their existence was a personal offense to the Sultan now. Ottoman peasants weren't just poor, they were taxed into poverty. You think modern rent is bad? Try forking over 1/3 of your crop yield to the state, another chunk to the local landholder, and whatever was left to feed your 12 children, 3 goats, and 1 perpetually confused chicken. And no, you didn't get a receipt. Just the distant sound of the multi-seam whistling while taking your onions. The peasant's life was governed by a long, soul-crushing list of taxes. There was the resamai kift, the basic land tax because God forbid you own dirt without paying for. The privilege. Then there was a vraise, an irregular tax for emergencies, which happened with regular, almost comedic frequency. War in Persia, a vraise flood in Egypt, a vraise the Sultan stubbed his toe on a marble floor. A vraise, obviously, and just when you thought it couldn't get more bizarre, there was the beard tax. Yes, you were taxed for your facial hair. Apparently, whiskers counted as luxury. Meanwhile, if you didn't have a beard, you might be suspected of being a young bachelor who wasn't pulling his marital weight, and thus taxed as well. So basically, the state found a way to monetize your face, precursor to Instagram filters. You decide most of these peasants didn't own their land outright. They worked under the timmer system, a lovely setup where military officers were granted rights to the land, and the peasants living on it were expected to pay taxes, farm the fields, and clap politely whenever a soldier rode by. The officer, in return, was supposed to protect the region and report to the empire. In reality, he mostly just collected taxes with the enthusiasm of a caffeine-fueled raccoon and left the villagers to deal with bandits themselves. Daily life, miserable. You woke before sunrise, worked fields so dry they crunched like old bread, and came home to a clay hut with a straw roof that leaked in precisely 3 strategic places. Dinner was lentils, again. Occasionally you'd mix things up with onions, or, in good years, dried yogurt. Ah yes, the luxury cuisine of the semi-taxed, and still, you were expected to pay. Always, even if your harvest failed, even if your barn burned down, even if your goat got stolen by the tax collector, which, believe it or not, actually happened in more than one recorded case. But here's where things start to boil over. Sometimes, entire villages just snapped like a broken ox cart on a muddy road. Villagers would rise up, drive out the multizeme, hide their grain, forge records, or simply vanish into the mountains. One notable village in the Balkans allegedly filled its tax ledger with fake names: Mustafa, son of no one, Fatma, the invisible, and Goat, son of Goat. It worked for a while, until an audit revealed the town had more livestock than people and half the population shared a birthday. This wasn't just passive resistance, it was desperation. Because when the tax burden got too high, people didn't protest with signs, they left. Entire rural areas depopulated as peasants fled to cities, forests, or into banditry. When faced with a choice between poverty under a multizeme or freedom with a sword and a shady alias, well, Robin Hood starts, sounding like a reasonable career change. And the state noticed. They didn't like it, but they noticed. The Ottoman archives are full of panicked decrees ordering local officials to investigate why the peasants are disappearing. The answer was usually some flavor of, "You're taxing them to death." But the solution was never to lower the taxes. Instead, the empire just ordered more surveys, better records, and sometimes more taxes to fund those records. Let that sink in. They taxed the process of figuring out why people couldn't pay taxes. Of course, not all peasants suffered equally. Some were skilled laborers, blacksmiths, weavers, potters, and could negotiate slightly better terms. Others worked religious land, known as WAQF, and were semi-protected. But most just hoped for a decent harvest, a quiet tax season, and maybe, just maybe, a multizeme who wasn't actively plotting their financial extinction. Occasionally, hope took on mythic proportions. Stories circulated about the just sultan, a kind of imperial Santa Claus who would one day arrive in disguise, witness the villagers' suffering, and fire the corrupt officials on the spot. These stories were pure fantasy, of course, but they spread like wildfire. Because when your daily reality is dust, debt, and disrespect, a good bedtime story might be all you have. And still, somehow, they endured. Through droughts, wars, earthquakes, and tax audits. Ottoman peasants were the load-bearing peas of the empire, forgotten in court poetry, ignored in grand architecture, yet utterly essential. Without them, the palaces crumble, the armies starve, and the sultans weep alone in gold-threaded pajamas. So next time someone tells you they don't make people like they used to, point them to the Ottoman peasant, underpaid, overworked, and still upright, at least until the next tax season arrived, with a multizeme grinning at the door, and a goat who looked suspiciously like last year's collateral. Welcome to the Ottoman Empire's true weapon of mass control: paperwork, Not cannons, not cavalry, just sheer unrelenting documentation. Paper stacked on paper, sealed, inked, filed, sometimes perfumed, and always judging you from across the centuries, like a disappointed librarian with imperial power. At the heart of this maddeningly methodical ecosystem was the defter, a tax register so exhaustive it could tell you how many sheep your grandfather thought about buying in 1584. The word defter literally means notebook, but that's like calling the Titanic a canoe. These things were huge, leather-bound, handwritten, and often thicker than the bureaucrats who carried them. They weren't just records, they were epics. Imagine if Tolkien's Silmarillion had been about barley quotas and plumbing fees. So, who wrote these tomes of agricultural despair? Enter the Ottoman scribes, the unsung monks of fiscal misery. These weren't casual note-takers. These were elite, calligraphy-slinging, ink-splattered, hunched-over-desk goblins trained for years in the art of recording the empire's soul, with just enough passive aggression to make every note feel like a subtle insult. Miss a payment. They'd write it in such exquisite handwriting that your great-great-grandchildren would feel embarrassed just reading it. And yes, the margins mattered. Some scribes filled them with floral flourishes or tiny poetic verses that said, in essence, "Dear taxpayer, we see your lies, and we are unimpressed." One scribe even wrote a warning in red ink that translated roughly to, "If you are reading this and trying to fudge the numbers, may your ink run dry forever." Subtle, but this wasn't just a hobby. This was the machine that kept the empire running. These documents recorded land use, harvest yields, tax obligations, religious demographics, military service availability, and possibly the quality of someone's beard if it seemed relevant. The empire's administrative class built an entire identity around these ledgers. Without them, there was no taxation, no military levies, no sultan's banquet, no anything. Welcome to the Ottoman Empire, where honesty was respected, virtue was admired, and bribery was pretty much a second currency. If the official route took 6 months, 3 witnesses, and an imperial seal soaked in unicorn tears, the bribe took 20 minutes and a nice pouch of coins. Efficiency, thy name is corruption. Now, to be fair, the Ottomans didn't invent bribery. That honor probably goes to whoever first traded a dead fish for slightly less punishment in a Sumerian courtroom. But the Ottomans perfected it. They didn't just tolerate corruption. They structured entire processes with the assumption that someone, somewhere, would slip someone else a gift. Of course, they didn't call them bribes. That would be tacky. No, these were botches. A delightful word that technically means tip, but culturally translated to please forget this form exists. It was the social lube that kept the empire's many gears turning, especially when those gears were rusted from neglect and buried under 2 tons of defters. Let's say you're a landowning farmer in 17th century Anatolia. You've just been told your taxes have increased by 40% because your barley looked suspiciously abundant. You know it's nonsense. You also know disputing it through the official courts will take 3 winters and a favor from a cousin in Istanbul who might be dead. You could quietly meet the tax clerk behind the mosque, offer a few silver coins, and hear those magic words, "Perhaps we misread the harvest report." It was so common, it practically became an unofficial policy. Ottoman scribes, judges, soldiers, even palace eunuchs, everyone had a price, and it wasn't always money. Bribes came in the form of livestock, cloth, food, or in one recorded case, a rather flirty poem delivered with suspicious sincerity. Some scribes accepted coffee as payment, which is historically beautiful, because you could literally bribe your way out of a fine with a hot beverage and a smile. But here's the twist. Bribery wasn't always illegal. In many contexts, it was. More of a grey zone, a social expectation masked as generosity. You didn't have to tip your judge after a favorable ruling. But if you didn't, don't expect leniency next time your goat escapes into the neighbor's orchard and starts a property dispute. And if you were poor, you were, as they say, out of luck and in the mud. The system punished the If you couldn't afford to sweeten the process, you got the worst end of it. Longer wait times, higher tax assessments, false accusations, and cold stares from men who suddenly forgot how to read. You didn't just pay with silver, you paid with suffering. Nowhere was this more visible than in the Codi courts, the local legal bodies responsible for handling civil disputes, contracts, inheritances, and, of course, tax appeals. These courts were theoretically bastions of Islamic justice, impartial and righteous, but in practice, if your rival had deeper pockets, your righteous cause might drown under a stack of suddenly missing paperwork and the multi-zine. Oh, they were knee-deep in this beautiful mess. Many tax collectors made side deals with regional elites, offering them discounted rates in exchange for support, which sometimes meant public silence, and other times meant forcibly discouraging villagers from complaining. The multi-zine became both judge and executioner in financial matters, and if anyone dared push back, well, they could always report you to another official, who was probably your cousin, who also accepted bribes. Let's not forget the military class, either. The Sepahi cavalrymen, who were technically supposed to defend their districts and ensure fair tax collection, were often themselves tangled in corruption webs. Some took bribes to look the other way. Others demanded them just to do their jobs, a tradition that's basically survived in every bureaucratic system to this day. Now dressed in fancier uniforms and digital interfaces, but perhaps the most tragically beautiful part of this system was how normalized it became. Entire documents written in gloriously elegant Ottoman Turkish laid out how much should be gifted for each type of favor. These weren't bribes, these were guidelines. A standard fee, if you will, for the privilege of being treated like a human being. Need a land reassessment? That'll be 1 gold piece and a warm smile. Need a criminal conviction overturned? 3 goats, a silken scarf, and maybe an ode to the judge's eyebrows. Trying to get your neighbor's tax bill reassigned to you accidentally on purpose. Price negotiable, bring wine. Now here's the kicker. Despite all this, the empire didn't collapse. Not immediately. Somehow, this shadow economy of favors, gifts, and suggestions kept things moving. It slowed things down, sure. It distorted justice, absolutely. But it also filled the gaps in a bureaucratic system too complex for its own good. In a weird, perverse way, bribery made the state more functional still. Corruption has a cost. Over time, faith in the system eroded. People stopped believing in fair outcomes. Justice wasn't blind. It was just squinting behind a curtain of coins. And when belief dies, rebellion brews. Whole regions grew bitter. Some fled, some fought. Some simply adapted and taught their children how to bribe better than they ever could. Let that sit for a moment. A society where the most valuable education is learning how to manipulate a broken system, where your survival hinges not on your honesty or work ethic, but on your connections and gift-trapping skills. It's funny until it's not. Still, the Ottomans weren't stupid. They tried to fix it. Sultans issued decrees banning bribery. Grand viziers promised reforms. Occasionally, corrupt officials were executed in very public, very creative ways. But like trying to scoop water with a sieve, it was too little, too late. The bribe was already part of the architecture, hidden in the walls, whispered in the corridors, stamped invisibly on every def so. Next time you're stuck at the DMV, and someone with connections breezes past with a wink and a smirk, take comfort. You're living in the shadow of centuries-old tradition. The Ottomans were here first, sipping their bribed coffee, scribbling elegant lies in scented ink, and pretending the system still made sense. Now that we've slogged through the tax-scorched countryside and bribery-swamped courtrooms, let's take a slow, dusty ride into the urban jungle, the Ottoman cities, where the food is spicier, the hats are taller, and the taxes somehow even more confusing. Welcome to places like Istanbul, Cairo, Aleppo, Damascus, and Baghdad, glittering trade hubs of the empire, each one humming with the smell of roasted meat, ink, sweat, incense, and exactly 12 different kinds of corruption. These cities were less organized municipalities and more vaguely regulated chaos held together with prayer beads and sheer caffeine. Now you'd think that being in a big city meant better systems, more order, central oversight, an office with a plaque. But no. Taxation here was less a system and more an interpretive dance, one that involved guilds, merchants, courts, caravan traders, janissaries, corrupt inspectors, and the occasional camels stuck in traffic. Let's start with the lifeblood of Ottoman. Urban centers, trade, markets or bazaars weren't just where people bought dried apricots and embroidered slippers. They were economic micro-universes. Every sale was taxable, technically, but actually enforcing that. Picture a man trying to count grains of rice during a monsoon, while being screamed at by 4 bakers and a butcher with anger management issues. There were market inspectors, called mutasibs, whose job was to make sure people paid fair prices, used honest weights, and most importantly, paid the correct taxes. In theory, these were noble enforcers of justice. In practice, they were often overwhelmed, underpaid, and extremely susceptible to friendly encouragement. A few coins under the table, and suddenly your butcher's scales were calibrated, your soap stall certified, and your illegal tavern strategically overlooked. But cities had other economic nodes too, especially the caravanserais. Think of them as medieval Ottoman truck stops, giant courtyard complexes where merchants rested, animals drank, and caravans offloaded silks, spices, ceramics, and rumors. These places were crawling with scribes and clerks ready to document every transaction, count every bolt of fabric, and of course, slap on the appropriate customs taxes. It was taxing the motion of things. If it moved, it was taxed. If it sat still, it was inventoried. If it disappeared, you probably bribed the clerk, who then marked it in transit for the next 6 months. And let's not forget the guilds, powerful craft collectives that controlled professions from baking to blacksmithing. Guild members paid dues, protected each other's interests, and crucially, negotiated their own tax arrangements. Some guilds had sweet deals, paying fixed rates or offering bribes in bulk, which is somehow both efficient and morally bleak. Others just lied often, creatively, about how much they made. One shoemaker guild famously listed half their inventory as damaged by humidity, which is Ottoman code for we sold it under the table. So you have the state trying to monitor commerce, and the city merchants doing jazz hands around. Every rule but the real wild card in the urban tax game, property tax. Because in the cities, everything was stacked: homes, shops, animals, courtyards, hammams, and no one could agree on where one ended and the next began. Land ownership. Records were notoriously unclear. Many families lived in the same homes for generations without any paperwork, relying entirely on neighborhood consensus. Everyone knows that Fatma's family owns that house. Okay, but when Fatma dies, and her cousins claim it, suddenly, the tax collector arrives like a game show host shouting, "Who wants to be a homeowner?" Sometimes, entire neighborhoods were listed under a single name, often someone long dead, which meant no one paid tax for years, until a particularly motivated official dug up the record and handed out decades of back taxes like surprise party favors. Reactions ranged from polite confusion to literal riots. And speaking of riots, let's talk urban unrest, because nothing inflames a city quite like unfair taxation. Take Aleppo, late 17th century, the price of soap, yes soap, had skyrocketed. Because of a tax hike on olive oil, the primary ingredient, merchants protested. The city mufti backed them. The governor tried to suppress it. And next thing you know, you've got an uprising with suds, swords, and shouting in 5 dialects, or Istanbul, where bread taxes led to price surges, which led to mobs, which led to bakeries being looted, which led to the government saying, okay, maybe we went too far with the gluten fees. Urban tension was always simmering, a mix of economic strain, political whispers, and the universal human desire not to be financially punished for existing. And into this powdered keg stepped the ultimate accelerant, miscommunication, Ottoman. Tax notices were handwritten in elegant, formal Ottoman Turkish, a language so complex it was basically designed to not be understood by ordinary people. Picture a tax letter that reads like Shakespeare, dipped in molasses. Half the recipients couldn't read it. The other half read it wrong. And so, rumors bloomed. The tax is doubled. No, it's just for bakers. No, it's only bakers who wear red turbans. My cousin was fined for looking at bread. Chaos, bread-fueled chaos. But even amidst this madness, there was beauty. The architecture of tax offices, the smell of ink and coffee in cramped chambers of state, the quiet patience of a clerk filling out forms by lantern light. It was messy. Yes, often unjust, but also deeply human. Because at its core, the urban tax scene wasn't about money, it was about control. The state needed to know who you were, what you owned, and where your stuff was going. And you, the ordinary city dweller, just wanted to live, to sell your figs. Marry your cousin, don't judge, it was a thing. And hopefully avoid getting fined for an unlicensed rooftop chicken, and sometimes you pulled it off. You paid your dues, bribed the right guy, dodged the wrong one, and made it another month. Other times, you got taxed for a building you didn't know you owned, then fined for not paying the tax, then jailed for insulting the clerk's inkpot. But hey, at least the streets were clean. Sometimes, unless it rained, then everything floated and the records got wet and the tax inspector had to start all over again. So yeah, urban life, dynamic, profitable, terrifying. The empire's cities were the crossroads of empire, the stage of daily life, and the eternal battleground between state control and human improvisation. Let's dim the lamps and step into the most awkward dinner party conversation of Ottoman history, the intersection of taxes and religion. It's a delicate, complicated, occasionally explosive affair. Like serving pork at a Ramadan feast. You just know someone's going to storm out, and the host will pretend not to notice. In theory, the Ottoman Empire was a just Islamic state, ruled by the Sultan Caliph, whose job was to safeguard the faith and, of course, squeeze every last coin out of his multi-ethnic subjects. This meant, inevitably, that not everyone got taxed the same way, because nothing says equality like a sliding scale based on what building you worship in. Here comes the infamous jizya, the tax levied on non-Muslims, the dhimmis primarily, Christians and Jews, but also, at times, other faiths that somehow wandered into Ottoman territory and couldn't find their way out. In exchange for paying jizya, these communities were theoretically protected, free to practice their religion, and blissfully exempt from military service. Blissfully here is doing a lot of work, since you are also very much not exempt from casual social discrimination or, say, an annual mugging by bureaucracy. Let's set the scene. You're an Armenian shopkeeper in Bursa, 1612. You pay your regular market taxes, your guild dues, and, just for fun, the jizya, a little annual reminder that you're welcome here, but not that welcome. A team of officials, led by a bored-looking clerk with an ink-stained beard, appears at your door every year to collect. You must pay in person, and you must stand, literally, stand as they record your payment, while Muslims present are permitted to sit. Nothing says respectful tolerance, like getting a backache in your own home. But don't worry, your jizya money goes to a good cause. Specifically, it helps fund the empire's armies, palaces, and the occasional pet project of a sultan's third cousin. In some places, paying the jizya was the price of staying alive. Miss a payment and your legal protections vanished faster than a bureaucrat at closing time. You could lose property, legal standing, or in rare but memorable cases your teeth. Still, it wasn't all dire. Non-Muslim communities had their own legal autonomy, running courts, schools, and charitable foundations, all under the watchful gaze of the state. These millets, the millet system, allowed Armenians, Greeks, Jews, and others to manage their own affairs, right up to the point where money was involved, at which time the Ottomans reminded everyone who really owned the keys to the cash box. And here's where it gets fun. The empire taxed everyone. Muslims had their own tangle of tithes and levies, religious endowments, waqfs, and obligatory almsgivings a coat. If you were rich, you paid more. If you were a Sufi dervish with zero assets but a great beard, you might slip under the radar. But if you were a Christian or Jew, the jizya was the unavoidable, non-refundable. Please do not question the math annual tribute. Ironically, the jizya sometimes acted as a strange kind of shield. Many non-Muslims preferred it to the alternative: military conscription, pay a tax, or go fight the Habsburgs. For many, the decision was made before the question finished. As a result, some Muslim families allegedly bribed their way into the jizya rolls just to avoid getting drafted. Nothing says flexible bureaucracy like using a religious tax as a get-out cannon fire-free card. And yet, tolerance and profit often wore the same mask. The Ottoman state preserved incredible diversity. Istanbul's neighborhoods rang with the sounds of church bells, synagogue chants, and mosque calls to prayer. But every note, every candle, every celebration, all that vibrant culture, was also a revenue stream. Tolerance was good business. Or as an Ottoman Grand Vizier probably never said, love thy neighbor, but make sure he's paid up by Friday. Of course, it could turn dark fast. When state coffers were running low after a failed military campaign, say, or a sultan's expensive new bathhouse, guess who got hit first? Special levies on non-Muslims, emergency war contributions, sudden property assessments. Communities that had lived peacefully for generations would suddenly find themselves reminded of their special status in the least festive way possible. Still, non-Muslims were not always powerless. Wealthy Christian and Jewish families formed tight social networks, bribed officials, negotiated with local governors, and sometimes even loaned money to the Sultan himself. Imagine paying the empire's taxes and then having the empire borrow your tax money at interest. Historical irony so rich it should be taxed twice. Reflect for a moment. Can tolerance be monetized? In the Ottoman Empire, the answer was a resounding, if awkward, yes. Diversity wasn't just allowed, it was a line item in the budget, a tool for imperial stability, and an economic lifeline in a region that might otherwise have eaten itself alive in religious violence. But don't romanticize it. Underneath the harmony and the tax receipts, there was always tension. Communities thrived, but they never forgot that protection was conditional, and acceptance could be revoked at the stroke of a scribe's pen. In times of crisis, suspicion surged. Pogroms, riots, scapegoating, all these shadows lurked just behind the gilded curtain of coexistence. So, if you picture the Ottoman Empire as a mosaic, understand that every tile paid for its place. Religion and taxation were stitched together with ink, hope, and a heavy dose of mutual suspicion. The bureaucracy was omnipresent, and, in its own weird way, democratic. Everyone paid. Some just stood while they did it. Let that sink in as we move forward. Tolerance, diversity, empire, all impressive on paper. But check the margins, count the coins, and follow the receipts. And you'll see, sometimes, the price of belonging was quite literally printed in the ledgers. Let's slip into the battered boots of a man named Yusuf. Not Yusuf the conqueror, or Yusuf the wise, or even Yusuf the mildly successful. No, this is Yusuf, the tax collector, a title which, as we've established, is about as glamorous as lead leech extractor or chief rat catcher. And today, fate has scheduled Yusuf's worst day ever. Our story begins at sunrise. As a pale light struggles through the smoke-stained windows of Yusuf's cramped quarters, he sits up, listens to the familiar symphony of distant donkeys, and sighs. On the wall hangs his official ledger, a battered defter filled with scribes, squiggles, mud stains, and at least one doodle of a goat drawn by an angry peasant child. Under the ledger, Yusuf's kit, ink, quill, a small purse for bribes, don't judge, and a crust of bread hard enough to double as self-defense. His instructions for the day are clear. Visit 3 villages, collect overdue taxes, and, ideally, return with both his shoes and his dignity. But from the moment Yusuf steps outside, the omens are bad. The street is unusually quiet. Even the dogs, usually so enthusiastic about chasing tax collectors, merely glance up with a look that says, "Really, again?" First stop, the hamlet of Karaki. Yusuf arrives with his assistant, Hallel, a man whose greatest ambition in life is to marry a woman with 3 cows and no opinions. They find the headman waiting, arms folded, surrounded by villagers, pretending not to glare. Yusuf starts his routine, reciting tax amounts, listing debts, and pausing for dramatic effect. Nobody moves. A baby cries. A chicken sneezes. Finally, an old woman hurls an insult so creative that Yusuf will remember it on his deathbed. He tries charm, then threats, then a discount on sheep taxes. Nothing works. The villagers say they're broke, the harvest failed, the goats are depressed. Halal, sensing trouble, nudges Yusuf. Maybe we should just write paid and go. Yusuf, with a scribe's misplaced sense of duty, insists on collecting at least something. The compromise: a basket of onions, 2 cracked eggs, and a promise to do better next season. Yusuf logs it all, knowing the Sultan's accountants will not be impressed. Onward, then, to the next village, a place so small it doesn't have a name, just a sign that reads, "Here be mud." Yusuf and Hallo slosh through puddles to the headman's house, only to find it empty. In fact, the entire village seems deserted. Windows are shuttered, doors barred. Even the stray cat wears an expression of plausible deniability. Yusuf knocks. No answer, he calls out, voice echoing across empty fields. Finally, a small child pops out of a barrel, hands Yusuf a note. "We are away. Please, come back, never." As Yusuf contemplates writing residents, temporarily dead, he hears a sound, the unmistakable clatter of hooves. He turns just in time to see a herd of goats stampeding toward him, apparently motivated by centuries of ancestral vengeance. Halal leaps aside, but Yusuf is not so lucky. He's bowled over, ledger flying, purse of bribes landing in a puddle. By the time he stands, dripping and humiliated, the goats have vanished, and so has any hope of getting paid today. Reflect for a moment. Is it any wonder tax collectors were universally loathed? Or that some days, the only record of their visit was hoofprints in the mud and the faint sound of laughter from behind closed shutters? But Yusuf is nothing if not persistent. Bruised, battered, and smelling faintly of goat, he heads for his final destination, the relatively prosperous village of Akilan here. Things seem brighter. The streets bustle with life. The air carries the aroma of baking bread. And, most importantly, the villagers don't immediately threaten him with a pitchfork. It seems too good to be true. And it is why Yusuf is invited to sit. Tea is poured. Questions are asked about his family, his health, his feelings about the weather. He starts to relax. Maybe, for once, the process will be painless. Then, with the subtlety of a brick, the village headman slides a parcel across the table, a small pouch of coins and a note reading, "For your troubles." Translation: "Here's a bribe. Please, for the love of God, lower our taxes." Yusuf hesitates. He knows the rules, knows the risks, knows he's being watched. Halal coughs loudly, a reminder that sometimes survival means looking the other way. Yusuf pockets the gift, lowers the official debt, and scribbles a line in the ledger that would make his old Yawn teacher faint then. As Yusuf and Halal make their way back to town, they are intercepted by a mounted patrol. It's the local Sepahi whose favorite hobby is inspecting tax collectors for irregularities. A quick search reveals the extra coins, the suspiciously generous deductions, and the mud-caked ledger. The Sepahi raises an eyebrow. "So," he asks, "did you collect what was owed, or just what you were offered?" For a moment, Yusuf considers telling the truth. Then he remembers the goats, the insults, the empty village, the near-miss with starvation wages, and the fundamental unfairness of the world. He shrugs. A little of both. The Sepahi smiles, pockets a coin, and tells Yusuf to keep up the good work. Halal, ever the pragmatist, hands over the rest of the onions. The day ends with Yusuf trudging home, a little poorer, a little wiser, and somehow still employed. Let that settle in the Ottoman Empire. Even the worst day for a tax collector wasn't a spectacular disaster. It was just normal. A little corruption, a lot of misery, and the stubborn hope that tomorrow, maybe, the goats will be kind. Let's take a slow, panoramic zoom out, drifting high above Yusuf's muddy boots and bribe-smudged ledgers. Imagine the empire itself as a vast, glimmering beast, scales of gold and shadow, stretching from the chilly forests of Hungary to the burnt ochre of Arabia. From a distance, the Ottoman machine looks unstoppably, its armies invincible, its palaces unrivaled, and, most importantly, its coffers bottomless. But get closer, squint past the domes and minarets, peer into the state treasury, the imperial mint Darfanai Amire. It's a place that should smell like victory and incense. Instead, the scent is part gold, part desperation, part stale, sweat the air heavy with the burden of keeping an empire solvent in a world that refuses to stop changing. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. All those taxes Yusuf and his fellow collectors squeeze out of peasants, merchants, and bribe-happy bakers are the only thing standing between the Sultan's grandeur and an economic nosedive. Every war waged, every mosque built, every pomegranate imported for the royal table, funded by a million moments of daily grinding misery in the villages and bazaars. And at the center of this economic web sits the Sultan himself. On paper, he's the shadow behind every tax, the voice behind every decree. In reality, he's an emperor in a golden cage, presiding over a bureaucracy so Byzantine it might as well have been designed by a committee of sleep-deprived cats. He needs money. For his armies, the Janissaries, who require not just salary but new boots, muskets, and the occasional motivational parade. He needs money for his courtiers and harem, for city improvements, the Let's Not All Die of Plague campaign, for the endless construction of fountains, baths, bridges, and naturally more palaces. But here's the rub. The empire's expenses are growing fast. Wars against Persians and Austrians aren't getting any cheaper. The Janissaries are hungry for gold and hungrier for power. The harem's silk budget alone could fund a small revolution. And while revenues might look impressive on a scribe's chart, the reality is, the empire is starting to crack. The problems begin, as they often do, with creative accounting. Defterders, those masters of the imperial spreadsheet, find themselves massaging the numbers, squeezing peasants harder, inventing new taxes, and reassessing the value of Anatolian mud until it gleams like silver. They issue more tax farming contracts, sell off the rights to collect duties on salt, bread, soap, even fish. Each new tax, each new multiseme, is supposed to fill the vaults, but in practice, it just makes the system leakier. And then there's the mint, Ottoman coins, the achy, later replaced by the kuru, start getting smaller, thinner. Their silver content watered down, sometimes literally. It's called debasement, and it's the economic equivalent of watering the soup and praying nobody notices. But people do notice. Prices rise. Bread costs more. Soap costs more. Wages lag behind. Suddenly, everyone's paying more taxes with money that buys less and less. The effect, a subtle rot, spreading through the core of the empire. The army, once famed for its discipline, starts to fray. Janissaries stage protests over missed pay, or simply collect their salaries from the city themselves, one unlucky merchant at a time. Provincial governors grow bolder, skimming off the top, building local fiefdoms with private militias, The Sultan writes angry letters. The governors file them under maybe later. For the villagers, it's a slow disaster. Every year brings a new tax, a new demand. This year, a contribution for the Persian campaign. This season, a levy for the fleet at Alexandria. This month, a surprise audit because the local scribe suspects your sheep are faking illness. People grow tired, poor, angry. Some flee to the mountains. Others join rebel bands. In Anatolia and the Balkans, whole districts depopulate. Fields go untilled. Roads crumble. The empire becomes less a community and more a sprawling extraction scheme, where every new problem is solved by wringing the population a little drier. It's not just peasants who feel it. City merchants grumble. Guilds protest. Even the palace feels the chill. New fountains slow to a trickle. Foreign embassies whisper that the sick man of Europe is catching a fever. The empire tries to innovate, tax reforms, coinage resets. Desperate treaties with foreign bankers, but these are band-aids on a bleeding wound. Still, the outward show continues. The Sultan throws festivals, feasts, and Friday processions. Fireworks burst above the Bosphorus. Envoys are showered with gifts and gold, the empire's mask held high. For a moment, the illusion of endless wealth persists. But under the surface, every scribe and collector knows the truth. They're writing IOUs against a system that's starting to buckle. Let that rest in your mind. Late at night, an empire held together by paperwork and hope, by exhausted peasants, and ambitious collectors, by coins that grow thinner with each passing year. The Sultan's gold, dazzling on the outside, is laced with rot within, and every new tax, every creative solution, only pushes the decay a little further down the line. But here's the real cliffhanger. What happens when the empire's piggy bank finally gets cracked open? When the peasants have nothing left to give, the collectors nothing left to squeeze, and the palace nothing left to pawn? Is there a bottom to this well, or does the bureaucracy just keep digging, oblivious, convinced that somewhere down there, another vein of gold is waiting to be found? Take a breath. The smell of ink and sweat lingers. We're not at the end yet, just teetering on the edge of something bigger, and possibly much, much messier. Now, let's turn from the peasant's dust and the Sultan's gold to the ironclad core of the Ottoman war machine, the Janissaries. Imagine the world's first professional standing army, famous for discipline, ferocity, and a collective flair for drama worthy of any reality show. For centuries, these elite soldiers were the envy and terror of Europot monk, part mercenary, all attitude. At first, Janissaries were forbidden from marrying, owning businesses, or doing basically anything fun outside their barracks. Their lives were supposed to be an endless cycle of training, prayer, and terrifying European emissaries with synchronized marching. But empires are living things, and rules in the Ottoman world were like ink on a wet ledger, prone to smearing, bending, and being creatively ignored. By the late 16th and 17th centuries, the Janissaries had discovered that having swords didn't just win wars, it also won arguments with the finance department. Salaries were supposed to be paid promptly, in hard silver, with all the ceremony of a religious holiday. When the money didn't arrive, the Janissaries didn't send angry letters. They staged walks. Think of it as a medieval version of a labor strike, but with more armor and a higher risk of arson. What's that got to do with taxes? Everything. Because while the empire's bureaucrats were inventing new ways to count chickens and peasants, the Janissaries were quietly negotiating their way out of the whole tax business. It started innocently enough, a stipend here, an exemption there, a one-time bonus for loyalty. But soon, the army became a fiscal black hole. They didn't just drain state revenue. They rewrote the rules in their favor. Janissaries owned property, opened bakeries, started breweries, and bought shares in wait for its tax farms. That's right, the Sultan's finest soldiers were now landlords and multizemes, squeezing peasants from behind a desk instead of with a... Some even bribed their way into office, then bribed officials to look the other way. It was a kind of circular logic only an empire on the brink could tolerate. The effect, ordinary taxpayers noticed. Hard not to, when the guy demanding your sheep is also the one supposed to defend you from bandits. Village elders complained to judges. Guilds grumbled in the bazaars. Why do the Janissaries get a tax break? Why does Ollie, the Janissary, own 3 bakeries and a soap factory? The answer, as always, because they can. Every now and then, things threatened to explode. Rumors swept through Istanbul. The army would revolt. The Janissaries would demand reform. Taxes would be fair again. But it never quite happened. Why? Because no one wanted to risk it. The last time the Janissaries rebelled in earnest, entire neighborhoods burned. Grand viziers lost their heads literally, and the Sultan ended up barricaded in the palace, probably wishing he'd chosen a nice, quiet life as a shepherd. So, the revolts that did happen were more like extremely aggressive negotiations. The Janissaries would parade through the streets, shouting, banging on doors, sometimes burning the occasional tax office for effect. The bureaucracy, knowing a lost cause when they saw one, quickly offered concessions, more exemptions, back pay, a few ceremonial promotions, and just to keep things spicy a round of summary firings among the tax inspectors. But here's the tragicomic twist. All this posturing did nothing to fix the underlying problems. The more the Janissaries bled the state, the less there was to go around. The bureaucracy responded with more taxes, more bribes, and more creative accounting, which in turn made the Janissaries demand even more. It was like 2 vampires locked in a room, arguing over who gets the last drop. And through it all, the ordinary people, the bakers, butchers, water carriers, scribes watched, in quiet, exhausted fury. The system was broken, but revolt seemed pointless. The Janissaries, who once stood as the backbone of the empire, had become just another class gaming the system. They played at rebellion, but only when it suited their paychecks. Let's slow down here, breathe that inner society where power doesn't just corrupt. It files a tax exemption form, submits it in triplicate, and then threatens to burn down the office if it isn't processed by Tuesday. There's a dry, inescapable irony in it all. The very men who were supposed to uphold the Sultan's order were now its most shameless manipulators. And yet, no one really wanted a true revolt. The bureaucracy needed the Janissaries' muscle. The Janissaries needed the bureaucracy's paperwork. Each propped up the other in an endless game of chicken, where the loser was always without fail the average taxpayer. Every empire has its death spiral, its long, slow descent from grace. In the Ottoman case, it wasn't always a grand battle, or a glorious collapse. Sometimes, the decay was administrative. Death by exemption, by loophole, by the slow erosion of trust in the system. No fireworks, just the quiet rustle of more paper. So next time you wonder why governments move slowly, or why systems seem to serve those at the top, remember the Janissaries, once heroes, then landlords, then symbols of a system that forgot how to renew itself. Their revolts were warnings, a signal that when everyone plays the tax game, eventually no one wins. Reflect on that as you drift off, or as you stand in line at the modern tax office, wondering if that guy in front of you owns 3 bakeries and a soap factory. 2. Let's pause on the main road of Ottoman history, away from armies and gold, and turn down the narrow, winding alleyways where women moved quietly in the empire's shadow. If you believe the old defters, women were invisible, rarely named, seldom counted, almost never taxed directly. But read between the lines, and you'll find stories of survival, wit, and resistance. Stories that make the average tax collector look like a bumbling amateur in life's real game. Start with the Ottoman widow. She was supposed to be a figure of pity, bereft, powerless, shrouded in black, her fate dependent on the kindness of relatives or the whims of officials. But widows, much like onions, have layers, and, as any scribe who underestimated one quickly learned, those layers could slice. Picture Fatma, somewhere in Anatolia, 1723. Her husband, a minor guildsman, has died, possibly from natural causes, possibly from the cumulative effect of paying taxes and listening to tax collectors recite harvest quotas. The multizeme arrives, ready to extract what he thinks is due. He finds Fatma, black-robed but sharped, standing in her doorway. Widows pay half. She informs him coolly, quoting a regulation she shouldn't know but absolutely does. The collector hesitates, tries to argue, then gives up and takes his coins, muttering curses. The next week, he's back with new paperwork, claiming her late husband owed more. Fatma presents a court record, carefully preserved, showing the debt was settled at his funeral. The multizeme retreats, defeated by bureaucracy weaponized against itself. Stories like Fatma's weren't rare. Ottoman women learned to navigate the system with a quiet expertise. They went to the Qadi courts in astonishing numbers, especially in cities like Istanbul and Edom. These courts, which technically offered equal access to men and women, became a stage for the most unglamorous but important performances of daily resistance. 1. 18th century case features a widow who appeared before the Qadi with 5 witnesses, and a pile of receipts to prove the local multizeme had been overcharging her for years. She laid out her argument, witness by witness, document by document. The judge ruled in her favor. The collector, caught in the act, was fined and forced to pay the fine to her. Revenge, Ottoman style, sweet, bureaucratic, and perfectly legal. And what of unmarried women, or those with no family? Some lived as tenants or servants, blending into the urban fabric. Others joined religious foundations, the WAQF, where property and income were theoretically protected from taxation and male relatives alike. Clever women invested in WAQF land or had male friends front properties on their behalf. A handful even founded waqfs themselves, running schools, bakeries, or soup kitchens under their own names, technically outside direct imperial reach. But resistance wasn't always about paperwork. Sometimes it was quieter. A landlord's daughter in Bursa carefully underreported her dowry, knowing her future husband's family would be taxed on the value. A group of market women in Aleppo staged what can only be described as a slow protest, arriving late and leaving early until the guild agreed to fix market taxes at a fairer rate. Even in the harem, the Sultan's wives and concubines managed vast networks of investment, influence, and quiet negotiation. manipulating tax officials from behind screens with whispered words and strategic gifts. Then there were the stories, with a harder edge. When the tax burden got too heavy, some women led entire households to new villages, changing their names and histories along the way. In desperate times, they joined bandit bands or started them. The Ottoman archives, ever alert for unusual names in tax records, include more than a few cases of widows wanted for evading taxes and agitating their neighbors. Of course, all of this existed within the limits of empire. Women had to walk a line between assertiveness and survival. Push too hard, and you risked angering the local Qadi who could rule against you out of spite. Stand by quietly, and your property, dignity, or family could be eroded one tax at a time. The empire's rules were a labyrinth, and women learned to trace its paths with a mix of cunning, community, and sheer stubbornness. Pause for a moment. Let that reality settle. Resistance wasn't always loud. Sometimes it's the soft voice in a court chamber, the careful keeping of receipts, the everyday refusal to be erased by a line in a ledger. Because behind every grand story of empires and sultans, there's an untold epic of people, often women, outsmarting the system, keeping families alive, defending dignity inch by inch. These aren't tales of revolution. They're stories of endurance, of holding on when the world tells you to let go, of finding small victories in the margins of power. It's no wonder that Ottoman scribes, trained to document everything, often overlooked these stories. You won't find them celebrated in palace poetry or gilded miniatures. But read between the lines, and they're a silent history written in the defiant signatures on court petitions, in the hush of a market at dawn, in the pages of ledgers that bear just a little more hope than despair. So, the next time you hear someone wax nostalgic about the order and stability of the Ottoman past, remember Fatma and her sisters. They didn't storm the palaces. They didn't rewrite the laws. But through wit, patience, and the occasional forged receipt, they found a way to exist, and even, sometimes, to win. Let's turn the hourglass and let a fine, bitter darkness swirl down through Ottoman life, coffee. Because, for all the empires, grim bureaucracy for every bribe and midnight ledger, sometimes it was a cup of coffee that triggered the loudest unrest, and the most creative tax avoidance in the history of caffeinated beverages. Picture a city street in 17th century Istanbul. The call to prayer echoes, the markets alive with hawkers, and a dozen tiny coffee houses hum with the gossip of merchants, mystics, and would-be poets. Coffee isn't just a drink. It's a public good, a lifestyle, an edible loophole in the fabric of society. And like all good things in the Ottoman world, it quickly gets taxed. At first, it's a modest levy. Coffee's a new import, exotic, mysterious, rumored to inspire both intellectual brilliance and marital discord. But as it becomes the drink of choice for night owls and rebels alike, the state's interest grows keener. What started as a casual fee morphs into a labyrinth of taxes on the beans, the cellars, the cups, the houses, even the right to sit and sip. Because, you see, coffee houses are trouble. The empire's rulers realize it too late. These aren't just places for a quick drink. They're the Wi-Fi cafes of their day, centers of debate, satire, and dissent. One scribe's light conversation is a pasha's seditious rumor. Every heated exchange about taxes and janissaries starts, somehow, with a shared pot and a glance over the rim. The state tries everything to control the flow. Taxes rise, licenses multiply. Special inspectors are dispatched to count the beans and weigh the grounds. In some years, the authorities ban coffee outright on the grounds that it makes people think too much. Bans, however, only make the lines longer and the bribes fatter. The city's alleyways bloom with secret cafes, backroom samovars, and doormen who ask for a password and a silver coin. It's not just a city thing. Coffee ripples outward, carried by itinerant dervishes, smugglers, and soldiers. Small towns develop their own rituals, mixing coffee with sugar, cardamom, or a secret dash of rebellion. The rural multizim, once tasked only with counting sheep and onions, now finds himself hunting for unlicensed roasters, trying to decipher whether that clay pot on the fire is brewing trouble or just a little morning joy. And then comes the debt, because while the empire's tax collectors are inventive, coffee drinkers are even more so. Faced with rising costs, urbanites turn to their local credit man, the tefikta, shadowy moneylender. Suddenly, the price of a cup isn't just about taxes. It's about IOUs scribbled on napkins, whispered deals in shadowy corners, a little extra interest added to each round. The coffee debt builds and builds. Whole neighborhoods are caught in a web of caffeine-fueled borrowing. Some houses keep two ledgers, one for the state, one for the local cafe. When an inspector arrives, everyone drinks tea, swears they hate coffee, and hides the beans behind religious texts or in the folds of their robes. Inspectors themselves are not immune. Many leave town with their purses heavier, their hands shaking just a bit more than usual. Let that settle, civil unrest, but with a heady aroma. Imagine Starbucks being declared contraband after 6 p.m., and you'll start to feel the anxiety and absurdity. Coffee taxes weren't just about money, they were about control, about curtailing spaces where people could talk, plot, and occasionally dream beyond their station. But the resistance is sly. In Aleppo, bakers slip coffee beans into their bread shipments, paying a wheat tax instead. In Cairo, peddlers disguise coffee as medicinal syrup, complete with forged prescriptions. One enterprising woman in Izmir registers her coffee house as a reading room, claiming she only serves refreshment for the mind. It works for 2 years, until the inspector's wife is caught with a stained mustache and a new taste for rebellion. And still, debt grows. For the empire, coffee becomes a black hole of lost revenue and bruised pride. For ordinary people, it's a badge of cleverness, a shared wink in the face of an overbearing system. Caf owners boast about their run-ins with inspectors, show off hidden compartments, trade stories about who managed to bribe whom and for how much. They become local celebrities, the James Bonds of bean-smuggling. Even among the elite, the game goes on. Viziers throw secret coffee parties, inviting poets and clerks, posting lookouts at the doors. Sultans, torn between fear of sedition and their own addiction, issued bans and then quietly request a cup from their favorite eunuch. There's a gentle hypocrisy to it. All a society united in love for something it officially decries. But there's a darker edge. For those caught in debt, life grows precarious. Coffee houses sometimes double as pawnshops, collecting rings, scarves, or family heirlooms from patrons who just need one more cup. A few desperate souls are driven to theft, or worse, to selling their services as informers, betraying their friends for a little debt relief and state favor. And yet, even here, hope survives. People gather, night after night, to share warmth, laughter, rumors, and complaints. They toast to survival, to the chance to speak freely, to the tiny, bitter rebellion in each cup. The empire taxes their joy, finds their secrets, and all odds the coffee flows. So next time you sip something dark and delicious, remember, in the Ottoman world, coffee was more than a drink. It was resistance, community, and debt woven together with the quiet clink of coins and the louder heartbeat of a people who refused, in the end, to be silenced. Let's pause the story, just for a moment, to check in not just with our Ottoman ancestors, but with ourselves. If you're still awake, or maybe just somewhere between consciousness and a nap, congratulations. You've survived 12 chapters of goats, ledgers, bribes, and the enduring quest to avoid getting fined for being alive. Take a deep breath, you've earned it. Dust, ink, and a faint whiff of burnt coffee fill the air. That's history, and it lingers. But maybe, as you listen, a strange question forms. Why does any of this matter? Why obsess over the bean counting? The bureaucratic agony, the unpaid debts of some long-dead Anatolian named Yusuf. It's just paperwork and pain, right? Or is it something more? Let's dig a little. The truth is, Ottoman taxes aren't just a bedtime trivia dump. They're the invisible roots of the world we walk through every day. The echoes of their bureaucracy are everywhere, in every form you fill out, every receipt you stuff into, a drawer, every hold music you endure as you wait to argue about your utility bill. The old empire is gone, but its paperwork survives in the DNA of modern life. Take the simple act of waiting in line at the DMV. Maybe you've done it this week. Maybe you're haunted by the memory, the slow shuffle forward, the stale air, the growing suspicion that time is being measured in centuries, not minutes. If you ever thought this was a modern hell, think again. Ottoman peasants would recognize that shuffling line in an instant, except in their case. The penalty for forgetting a document might be losing your cow, not just your sanity. Or look at property taxes. The annual notice, the incomprehensible language, the mysterious fees, infrastructure, maintenance, seasonal adjustment, emergency assessment. Sound familiar? Ottoman scribes were masters of this art, cloaking tax increases in flowery prose and passive-aggressive warnings. Pay by the new moon, or risk a mild inconvenience, and possibly an audit. Modern governments have just swapped the calligraphy for Arial 12-point font. And what about the joy of the mid-level official? The modern clerk who stamps your application with the solemnity of a priest at a royal wedding. That sense of quiet power, the suspicion that they could ruin your whole year with a single keystroke. Yes, the Ottoman Qadi would be proud, or at least bemused to see his legacy thrive. But maybe, just maybe, there's a bigger lesson buried in this parade of taxes and tribulations. Every receipt, every bribe, every backroom cafe debate was more than just a transaction. It was a conversation between power and powerlessness, between the state and the individual, between the people who write the rules and the rest of us who live under them. Let that sink in. The great machinery of the empire, all those scribes, inspectors, and reluctant tax collectors, was built not just to collect coins, but to collect compliance, to remind everyone, every day, who really ran the show. The ledgers were weapons, as sharp as any sword. The real battle wasn't always in the fields or the palaces. It was fought in the margins, in the side notes, in the footnotes scrawled with hope or despair. And yet, out of all this paperwork and passive aggression, something else emerged. Community. The shared burden, the quiet solidarity of villagers, the whispers in the coffee house, the collective shrug of people who knew the system was broken but still managed to laugh. It's the same today. The memes about tax season, the shared misery. At the post office, the tiny rebellions, a forged signature here, a missing receipt there, a story told over tea about how you outsmarted the system. These are the threads that weave us together. Centuries after Fatma and Yusuf scribbled their stories in the margins, so, still watching, then you know what to do. Hit that like button, not because some sultan commands it, but because you've found kinship in the chronic discomfort of being ruled by forms and fees. Subscribe and join the ever-expanding millet of the historically curious and the quietly resistant. Algorithms may not tax you yet, but they certainly notice your loyalty. But the story isn't over, because what happens next, after the scribes run out of ink, after the janissaries trade their scimitars for bakery franchises, after coffee debts outnumber goats? Does the system break, or does it just mutate? Does anything actually change, or do we just swap ledgers for laptops and hope for the best? There's a reason so much of history happens off stage, in whispers and waiting rooms, in the spaces where official narratives break down and people improvise. Empires are built in broad strokes, but lived in the footnotes. The Ottomans understood this. Their legacy isn't just in ruins and recipes, but in the way people learned to navigate the impossible, to find joy in small loopholes, to endure the absurd with a smirk. If you're feeling a little drowsy, that's okay. History can be comforting like that, a lullaby of collective struggle, a reminder that this too shall pass. Even if it takes a few hundred years and several bags of tax receipts, maybe you've even drifted a little, your own mind writing footnotes on the margins of this story. So breathe that in, dust and all. Let the bureaucratic haze settle for a moment. You're not alone in the waiting room of history, and as you let your eyelids grow heavy, just remember, still watching, still curious, still resisting in your own way. If that isn't worth a like, what is? Collapse is a dramatic word, but in the Ottoman Empire, the end was less a sudden explosion and more a slow, exquisite unraveling silk thread pulled loose from the edge of an imperial robe. If you came here hoping for a fiery implosion, you'll have to settle for something quieter, an empire dying by 1,000 paper cuts, its bureaucracy bleeding ink until nothing's left but smudges and sighs. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Ottoman tax machine had become a tragic parody of itself. The ledgers were still huge, the officials still solemn, and the taxes still collected, or at least attempted, with relentless, ritualistic fervor. But behind the scenes, the system was fraying like the hems of a well-worn kaftan. Records no longer matched reality. Tax farmers grew richer while the countryside emptied out, fields abandoned by peasants who simply walked away. Why pay taxes when you could vanish into the city, or into banditry, or across a border that some mapmaker in Istanbul hadn't yet realized had moved? Let's step into a provincial tax office somewhere in Anatolia, 1825. The clerk is older than the furniture. The ink is watered down. The registers are out of date, full of dead names and empty houses. Yet still he sits, day after day, tallying debts that no one will ever pay. The grand ledgers grow heavier, but the coffers grow lighter. Each entry is a prayer, a wish for a future that refuses to arrive. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, the multiseams, those tireless, unpopular tax farmers, have gone fully rogue. With the Sultan's grip weakening, these men carve out their own petty kingdoms, extorting, bribing, and occasionally protecting their territories. Many no longer bother, forwarding their collections to Istanbul, unless there's a gun at their back or a sizable bribe to sweeten the deal. The empire's once mighty system is now just a patchwork of scams, IOUs, and faded threats. The peasants, many have given up. Why bother? Becomes a national motto, whispered from Thrace to Aleppo. Taxes can't be paid with crops that don't grow, nor with sons conscripted into armies, nor with coins debased into oblivion. Whole villages uproot, heading for new lives in cities already bursting at the seams, or joining the swelling ranks of rebels and bandits, the empire's most reliable growth industry. And the bureaucracy, sensing its own impotence, grows desperate. Reforms are announced with great fanfare. We will centralize. We will modernize. We will root out corruption. New officials arrive, waving new decrees, insisting this time will be different. Sometimes they really mean it, but the inertia is too great. The empire's tax machine is like a wagon stuck in mud. Every attempt to push it free just splatters more filth on everyone nearby. Meanwhile, the outside world closes in. European powers, smelling weakness and profit, begin to meddle with Ottoman finances. Loans are taken out to pay for wars and modern armies. And when the empire can't pay, the creditors demand control over customs revenues. Foreign advisors take over the ports and the post offices, installing their own systems that look suspiciously like the Ottoman ones, only now with more signatures and less forgiveness. Let that settle. When your enemies adopt your paperwork, you know things have gone very wrong. Inside the palaces, the sultans grow nervous. Some retreat into ritual, others lash out with frantic reforms. The janissaries, once the muscle of empire, become a threat so dire they are finally purged, eliminated, in a bloody coup that brings brief hope for renewal. Yet even after the janissaries are gone, the rot remains, lurking in the record books, in the shuffling of officials from office to office, in the endless meetings that solve nothing. It's not always dramatic. More often, it's slow, a missing harvest, a cancelled festival, a court case that never gets resolved because the files are lost or eaten by rats, or used for kindling during a winter famine. And each time, a little more faith slips away. Faith in the system, faith in the future, faith that anyone, anywhere, is actually in charge. But collapse isn't just about loss. It's about transformation. The empire's decline births new identities, new ambitions, new countries. The old paperwork is discarded door, more likely, recycled for wrapping fish, while new forms, new taxes, new schemes are dreamed up by would-be reformers and revolutionaries. What was once the way things have always been is now the way things used to be before everything changed. Pause for a moment and breathe that in. Sometimes the end of an era isn't a bang. Sometimes it's just the slow hush of paperwork piling up in empty rooms, the quiet exit of the last real believer. Sometimes it's just dull. And yet, for all its boredom, there's something weirdly comforting in this long fade out. The empire doesn't vanish overnight. It lingers, a ghost in the bureaucracy, a rumor in the waiting rooms, a line in an old tax register nobody quite understands. People adapt. They always do. The paperwork grows lighter, the rules a little looser, the system a little more human, or at least a little less inhuman. So, as the Ottoman Empire shuffles toward its inevitable finish, take a moment to appreciate the tragic poetry of it all. The dream of order undone by the sheer, irrepressible machinezas of real life. The Sultan's grand vision, chipped away not by invaders, but by missed payments and bad accounting. An ending not of fire, but of ink and exhaustion. And maybe, as you drift off, you'll realize, sometimes, the most revolutionary act is simply walking away from the counter, leaving the form unsigned. History likes to pretend it lives in museums, frozen behind glass. But the Ottoman Empire isn't dead, it's simply learned how to use a fax machine. Its soul, battered but persistent, lives on in the modern bureaucracies that haunt us today. Open a file cabinet in Istanbul or Ankara or even Berlin, and somewhere you'll hear the faint rustle of a defter, the echo of a scribe's sigh, the ghostly clink of a multi-zim-s bribe. Let's get honest. If you've ever filled out a form at a Turkish government office, you know the Ottoman system never really died. It mutated. You approach the counter, clutching your documents, feeling a strange kinship with every Anatolian peasant who once prayed for mercy at the Cadi's feet. You hand over your paperwork and brace for the verdict: missing signature, incorrect. Stamp, come back Tuesday. History repeats. Only now the ink is blue and the clerk's computer is suspiciously always down for maintenance. Turkey isn't alone. Across the Balkans and North Africa, fragments of Ottoman process survive, like stubborn weeds. Tunisia, Bosnia, Egypt. Step into a courthouse, pay a municipal tax, and you'll find the forms layered, complex, insistent on precision. The legacy isn't just the paperwork, it's the attitude, the sly smile, the whispered advice on how to speed things up, the mutual understanding that the system is both sacred and a little bit absurd. Why does this endure? Partly, it's habit. Bureaucracy has a half-life measured in centuries. When a form works even badly, it persists. Officials copy what they know. New governments inherit the ledgers, rename the offices, and declare reforms with great fanfare. But the bones of the old system remain: the urge to write things down, to demand receipts, to keep secrets in triplicate. There's more to it, though. The Ottoman approach to bureaucracy was never just about control. It was about belonging. Every name in a register, every house on a map, was proof of existence, at least to someone in Istanbul, or wherever the capital wandered next. If you weren't in the book, you weren't real. For all its flaws, the system created a kind of civic immortality. You lived on in ink, in margins, in coffee-stained ledgers stored for a rainy day. That mindset lingers in modern societies, too. We crave acknowledgement, even when it comes as a bill or a summons or an excruciating wait at the city office. Who among us hasn't felt a weird thrill upon receiving official mail? Ah, they know I exist. I matter. I am being taxed. It's not all dreary. Sometimes the Ottoman spirit emerges as a kind of stoic resilience. Turks joke that every office has a KGT server more powerful than the manager. Lines are softened by shared stories and past cups. There's a camaraderie in the waiting, an unspoken understanding that we're all in this together. Prisoners of forms and stamps, but united in our stubbornness. The phrase "Kalay Gelson, may it be easy," is muttered dozens of times. A day, a spell cast against bureaucratic despair. And yes, the old habits die hard. Bribes aren't what they once were, but gifts still grease the wheels. Family networks whisper tips for navigating the system. The smartest avoid the front desk entirely, sending friends of friends or even the odd fixer to handle their affairs. The Ottoman genius for improvisation survives, even in glass-walled ministries with digital displays. Look closer though, and you'll see the cost. People roll their eyes, laugh, and adapt, but frustration lingers. The system that once connected, a vast empire now, sometimes feels like a labyrinth built for its own sake. Young Turks, Egyptians, and Bosnians complain about paperwork just as their great-grandparents did. The modern state can feel as indifferent and unyielding as any pashas, court just less likely to be distracted by poetry in the margins. Still, every generation tries to reform. New governments promise transparency, efficiency, justice. For a while, it works until the paper piles up again. The old ways reassert themselves, and someone invents a new stamp that only 3 people in the country can legally apply. But it's not all bleak. The Ottoman soul carries a lesson about adaptation, about finding small victories in big, slow systems. Scribes wrote poetry in their ledgers. Taxpayers left jokes on petitions. Even the most jaded multizeme knew to laugh at his own misery. That humor, that persistence, that ability to bend without breaking it survives. Pause and breathe that in. The frustrations of modern bureaucracy are more than mere inconvenience. They're echoes of ancient struggles, proof that people have always found ways to work the system, to leave a mark, to survive the indifferent machinery of the state. Our complaints are old, our tricks even older. So, next time you wait in line, check your mailbox, or argue over a parking ticket, remember, you are living history. You're part of an unbroken chain that stretches back to the day a scribe in Istanbul dipped his pen and wondered if anyone would ever read his notes. And maybe, just maybe, that's a comfort knowing that behind every official stamp is 1,000 years of stubborn survival, a quiet defiance, and, somewhere, the ghost of a tired Ottoman clerk nodding in sympathy. Let's bring it full circle, out of dusty archives, out of crumbling palaces, and into the bright humming, impatient heart of modern Istanbul. The year is 2024. The air smells of roasting chestnuts and diesel, and the city skyline is all glass, steel, and minarets. We're about to witness the latest chapter in the family saga of Ottoman tax collectors. A man named Ahmet, direct descendant, or so his mother insists, of Yusuf, the not-so-great tax collector. Ahmet is not a tax collector. He is, in fact, a graphic designer who has never ridden a horse, wrangled a goat, or been chased by a peasant wielding a leek. His battle is fought in pixels and paperwork, not ledgers and bribes. But like his distant ancestor, Ahmet finds himself locked in mortal combat with bureaucracy and losing. It starts with a letter. Not a scroll, not a perfumed summons, but a perfectly ordinary piece of official mail. You owe back taxes. 3 words, 1 headache, and a sinking feeling that history is laughing at him. Ahmet, who pays his bills on time, who files every slip, who keeps his accountant's number on speed dial, is certain this is a mistake. But the letter is relentless in its formality. Failure to respond will result in penalties. Ahmet's journey begins on a Monday morning at the local tax office. The building is a brutalist monolith, its lobby echoing with the resigned sighs of citizens clutching folders. A digital display blinks red. The line does not move. At the counter, a clerk named Sybil stares at him through thick glasses, her expression a masterpiece of practiced indifference. Back taxes, she repeats, clicking at a keyboard that sounds like it's typing in Morse code. What year? Ahmet explains, shows his records, points to the obvious error, a duplicated payment. A missing receipt that he definitely submitted online. Sybil frowns, shrugs, tells him to wait. He waits. He texts his accountant. He listens to the coughs and mutters of the crowd. The minutes stretch, then hours. Outside, the call to prayer drifts by, ignored in the digital hum. He returns the next day, armed with new documents and old optimism. This time, Sabal is replaced by a young man named Burok, who insists the system is down but offers to look into it if Amot will just fill out form for 4B. Amot, already drowning in paperwork, asks why there is no online solution. Burok smiles apologetically. Some things, he says, never change. Here's where it gets surreal. The computer system, it turns out, can't process his payment because his grandfather's name is spelled differently on one document. The result of a 1950s clerk's creative spelling. The algorithm freezes, the taxes remain unpaid, and the penalties accumulate. It's a minor issue, Burek says, but you'll need to go to the district office. Maybe bring tea for the clerk. Advice as old as the empire. And so, Amot embarks on a journey through Istanbul's administrative labyrinth. Every office is a new level. Forms to fill, stamps to find, signatures to chase. He's sent to Kadıköy, then to Üsküdar, then to a nondescript building where time appears to stand still. At one stop, he meets an elderly woman fighting her own tax battle. She tells him about her grattant, who once outwitted a multizine with a forged receipt and a bribe of baklava. They share a laugh, bitter, knowing, somehow comforting. The days pass. The original problem grows stranger. A century-old land. Tax assessed on a property long since swallowed by urban development. An error in a digitized Ottoman defter that still, somehow, affects Amit's case. A modern clerk who can't fix it but can print out a copy for his records. Each new paper trail ends in a dead end or a sympathetic shrug. Bureaucracy, as Amit realizes, the most immortal empire of them all. He grows tired. He grows philosophical. He wonders how many hours Yusuf wasted arguing over chickens and onions. He wonders if anyone ever won, or if victory was just surviving long enough to tell the tale. But Amit is nothing if not stubborn. He returns one final time, this time with every document, every stamp, every whispered piece of advice. At the counter sits Sibyl again, sipping tea. She examines his stack, frowns, and, with a sigh of sympathy and perhaps kinship, keys in the fix. The screen flickers, the penalty vanishes. "You're clear," she says. For now. Relief floods Amot. He thanks her, steps into the street, breathes the cold city air. His battle is done, at least for this year. There is no parade, no poem in the margins, just the quiet pride of having survived another round in the Worlds. Longest-running paperwork contest. He stops at a cafe, orders a coffee, and texts his mother. Problem solved. You were right. We're definitely related to Yusuf. She replies with a string of emojis and a gentle warning. Keep every receipt. Forever. Pause for a moment and reflect. Empires rise, sultans fall, systems collapse and are rebuilt, but the daily struggle against bureaucracy endures. Passed from one generation to the next, like a family heirloom. The details change. The grind remains as Amit sips his coffee. He feels a strange connection to all those who came before, the peasants, the scribes, the tax collectors, the widows who fought with paperwork instead of swords. Their stories, big and small, live on not in marble statues, but in the quiet victories of people who refuse to be defeated by the system. No matter how many forms it throws at them, the empire is gone. The bureaucracy endures, and Amit, like Yusuf, will be back because history, it turns out, never really lets you go. So here we are, at the final ledger line, the last sheep in the pen, the exhausted sigh at the bottom of the world's oldest bureaucratic pyramid. If you've made it this far, you've wandered through centuries of ledgers, sweat, bribes, hope, onion breath, and human resilience. The question lingers, why bother? What does any of this actually mean? Let's not sugarcoat it. Being on the receiving end of Ottoman tax collection sucked. It sucked for peasants scraping by on lentils and bad luck. It sucked for widows defending their last 2 coins in court. It sucked for the scribes who risked their necks every time a decimal point drifted. And it even sucked, in a weird existential way, for the collectors who were caught between royal expectations and the pitchforks of angry villagers. There's a strange comfort in that no one was immune. Misery was the one truly universal tax. But step back and you'll see a bigger picture. All that suffering, that daily grind, was more than the machinery of an empire. It was the infrastructure of ordinary life. Taxes are rarely glamorous and almost never fair, but they are a kind of social glue, the inescapable price of living together, of building roads and courts, and sometimes keeping the peace. Without bureaucracy, chaos wins, but with it, well, you get something closer to survival. Most of the time. Yet the lesson isn't that we should love our tax officers. Far from it. It's that history is lived not in the palaces, but in the footnotes where people try and fail, and try again to wring a little decency out of systems built by strangers. Power isn't just kings and armies. It's the 1,000 little indignities and victories of the people trapped inside the machine. The Ottomans built their empire on receipts and bribes and protests, and every other society since has done the same, in its own language and ink. That's why these stories matter. Because whether you're a goat farmer in Anatolia or a designer in Istanbul, the details change, but the emotional landscape is stubbornly familiar. You dream of freedom, you bargain for fairness, you endure absurdity with a sense of humor that's half defiance and half exhaustion. And you learn sometimes painfully, sometimes triumphantly, that the boring stuff is where your real story lives. Pause for a moment. Let that truth drift through the dim-lit corridors of your memory. History's not just sultans and swords. It's someone like Fatma, clutching her receipts, staring down a corrupt official. It's Yusuf, dust-covered and hopeful, returning home after another day of small humiliations. It's Amit, weary but unbowed, stepping out of the tax office into the glare of a modern city that is, somehow, still haunted by the ghosts of old empires. Empires rise, empires fall, but paperwork is forever. And in that bureaucracy, relentless, often unfair leaves, the real relentless heartbeat of humanity. Persistence, the drive to outwit the system, to protect your own, to leave behind a name even if it's misspelled on a dusty form. The Ottomans didn't just conquer land, they conquered the art of keeping track, of writing things down, of making memory official. If you've ever looked at a bill and thought, there has to be a mistake, or pleaded with a clerk for mercy, or laughed about the absurdity of modern paperwork, congratulations. You are living history. You are part of the oldest club in the world. The society of people struggling under the weight of systems designed for someone else's convenience. But there's hope in that, too. Systems can be changed, even if it takes generations. Rules bend, loopholes widen, new voices speak up, new Fatmas and Yusufs and Omats find ways to resist and adapt. Sometimes you win, sometimes you just endure. And sometimes, miracle of miracles, you make things a little better for the next person in line. And if it's all a bit much, if the paperwork piles up, if the lines never end, if the rules make no sense at all, well, you're not alone. The Ottomans, with their scented ledgers and passive-aggressive scribes, knew exactly how you feel. They wrote the manual, and they left us all with a warning and a comfort. You can be crushed by the system, or you can find solidarity, laughter, and meaning in the shared struggle. So, as you drift off finally, maybe let yourself feel the weight and the wonder of all that boring history. You're part of a story older than you know, filled with frustration, creativity, and a stubborn hope that things can always be nudged, if not fixed. You are not alone in feeling crushed by systems. History says, welcome to the club. Take a number. Keep your receipts. Still awake. Then you've just wandered through centuries of spreadsheets, corruption, goats, and human struggle, Ottoman style. If this made you chuckle, sigh, or drift off gently to sleep, hit that like button and subscribe. For more slow burn stories from history's dusty corners, where the real drama unfolds one forgotten tax form at a time.